welcome to this very special event called Building Green, Energy Efficiency in Building. This is one of over 60 events across Green Week that are taking place this week in TU Dublin, which aims to build awareness and engagement around sustainability and climate action, so that we can take a positive stance and a positive approach to creating change. I'd like to welcome everybody who's braved the weather today to be here in person and everybody who's joining online. I'm Jennifer Boyer. I'm the Vice President for Sustainability at TU Dublin, and I'm delighted to welcome the European Commission, who has asked us to host tonight's event. We have a wonderful panel of speakers who I couldn't be more delighted to welcome to the evening to share their knowledge. Councillor Francis Noel Duffy, Green Party TD for Southwest and Dublin, and also a colleague in TU Dublin who I've worked with for a long time. John Burgess, Associate Director at Arup. Patrick Daly, who is a lecturer in the Architecture, Building and Environment School, the new school in TU Dublin. And Dr. Ciara Ahern, who's in Mechanical and Design Engineering, and also sits on the Irish Building Stock Observatory. At TU Dublin, we are so delighted to host such important events, particularly around things like the Energy Performance Building Directive. We have a lot of leading experts in the field who are here tonight and elsewhere across the university. And I suppose this is a momentous occasion for us to figure out how we do decarbonisation as part of the construction industry and achieve our 2030 targets for reductions, as well as net zero for 2050. We are bound by the European Green Deal, and Irish legislation is transposing itself into reality through this new directive. And I suppose we have the added reinforcement of the recent publication of our climate action plan in December, which has the follow-on annex having been published yesterday in terms of the key actions and measures we need to take across the nation to deliver on climate action. At TU Dublin, we have over 28,000 students, and we have 2,500 plus staff. We operate across 5 campuses within the Dublin region. And within that, we have our own building stock of over 40 buildings that have a variety of different ages and profiles and energy performance challenges. And we are now having to think very strategically about how we approach decarbonisation across what we are responsible and have within our control as part of our overall operations. We are in the throes as well of bringing out our academic knowledge and expertise into an operational action plan. And we will soon be publishing our TU Dublin Climate Action Plan to set out our ambitions across how we embed sustainability within the curriculum, how we engage in action-based research to create a living lab for our university campuses. And all of that requires us to gain additional capacity through new knowledge and skills to be able to embrace the change and be resilient throughout the next decade. So our ambition is to create a better world together as part of TU Dublin's strategic plan. And events and partnerships such as this provide a platform to exchange knowledge, have discursive debate, and to challenge each other about how we are going to achieve these dramatic reductions across what we have come to know as everyday operations across the next decade and beyond. So I'd like to thank the organizers. I'd like to thank my team members who've worked really hard to be very agile with all of the changes and likelihoods around the event. And I'd now like to hand over to Tim Hayes, who's the head of communications at the European Commission, represented in Ireland. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome, both those of you who are here in situ at TU Dublin and those who are watching online. So what we're going to have now is we're going to think a little bit about the challenges that face us, and in particular because of our overdependence on fossil fuels. And this has really come to the fore with the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And we in the European Commission believe that it's time to move away from particularly Russian fossil fuels, and to move towards environmentally friendly and sustainable sources of energy. So it's in this context that we're doing a series of events right around the country, where we hope to be able to speak to you and hear the views of an expert panel, and they really are an expert panel this time. We take questions from the floor afterwards, and we'll take questions from the people that are watching online. And you can do that by using Slido, and you'll find the Slido address in your description box when you're watching online. If you don't see that, go to slido.com, and the event code for this event is 2520387. That's 2520387. So we're looking forward to a very interesting night. Each of the expert panelists will speak for between 8 and 10 minutes. So we'll take, first of all, we'll take Francis, we'll start, and then we go to Ciara, and then we'll go to John, and then we will take some questions. Depending on the questions that come, we can direct them at each of the panelists, or maybe all of the panelists might want to answer, depending. So we're looking forward to a very interesting night. Once again, thank you to you, Dublin, for hosting us for this event. And could I please call on our first speaker? I mean, the thing is that this is live stream, so the microphone is up here. So I think it's probably better if you come here to speak. So Francis Duffy is a Green Party TD for Dublin South West. He's also the Green Party's spokesperson on housing. So he's been heavily involved in the community as both a public representative and a long-time lecturer at the Dublin School of Architecture. So his policies strive towards building sustainable housing for all, while he also wants to create a better community for people to live in. He's committed to improving public transport, cycling, pedestrian infrastructure, community development, especially in his constituency of Dublin South West. He's also the Green Party housing spokesperson, and he'd like to see Ireland's housing sector transform into one that's centred on affordability and is inclusive of all income levels. And in fact, Francis is wearing two hats tonight, because his party colleague, Ciara is the spokesperson in the European Parliament for this directive. We asked Ciara to come. It's not that we thought you were the second best, but we asked him to come in that context, but unfortunately he's got a press conference in Brussels this evening, and he just couldn't make it. So listen, the floor is yours, and we're very interested to see what you're going to tell us in the next 7 to 10 minutes. So, thank you.
Thanks very much. 10 minutes, I timed it. I'd like to thank the Commission and to you, Dublin, for having me here today. I hope my contribution provides some insight from my perspective as a legislator and a practicing architect. Today's discussion focuses on the challenges to meet our 2030-50 decarbonisation targets. This all being seen through the lens of the EU Green Deal's Fit for 55 and the revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. I'll speak a little bit about my background, Green Party Ciara Cuff's work as an MEP, and the work and follow up with the work I'm doing in the area, and in particular the pursuit of regulations for embodied carbon measurements and targets in the construction sector. My background, I graduated as an architect in '97 from this institution and returned to lecture in the School of Architecture for 19 years. I was honoured and privileged to run various modules, including Design Studio and the Environment, Services and Materials module. I titled the last design module, I ran Carbon Zero, endeavouring to enlighten students in the subject of embodied carbon and how we can reduce CO2 emissions through the lifespan of a building. My academic research and political mandate for the Green Party converged, putting me on the path to complete an MArch, researching why Ireland does not utilise timber in the construction sector akin to other countries, considering its sustainable materials and properties. And I must acknowledge Jennifer Boyer here for the creation of that MArch programme. It enriched my life as an academic and far beyond that, I have to say. The research allowed me the opportunity to table a motion which was unanimously supported to pass a wood first policy here in South Dublin County when I was a councillor, the first and only local authority, I believe, to consider wood over other materials when constructing their buildings. The MArch research also introduced me to embodied carbon, and I've spent a considerable amount of time as a legislator pursuing appropriate regulation to allow a new paradigm of construction, mainly through the use of cross-laminated timber. I've also been privileged to project manage a Pathfinder building here in Tallaght, where we are aiming to create a whole life carbon zero building, and we're at tender stage at the moment. I'm a TD, as mentioned, and spokesperson for housing. And in this role, I've worked on the implementation of the following green policies: legislated for 100% public housing and public land, the abolishment of co-living and SHD housing policies, the introduction of a defective dwellings bill, championed an embodied carbon report through the Housing Committee, the same report being passed in the Dáil as a parliamentary motion. Cost rental housing legislated for and put on a statutory footing, with the Land Development Agency will procure 30,000 units over the next 20 years. And town centre first policies and funding to tackle vacancy in our towns and villages, bringing life back to these rural cultural centres. So today I've been asked to share my thoughts on the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive and the challenges we have in Ireland to meet our 2030-50 decarbonisation targets. We'll start with Ciara Cuff, who is meant to be here. He's our Green MEP and has been the lead negotiator and the chair of talks, which has led to all political parties in the EU Parliament to implement the Energy Performance of Buildings Directives, which was approved on the 30th of January. Ciara's work on securing the EU Parliament's first mandatory minimum energy performance standards for the EU means that member states will have to comply in order to achieve the climate neutral building stock by 2050. This is part of the EU's Fit for 55 climate package, which is an EU target aiming to reduce net greenhouse gases by at least 55% by 2030. Fit for 55 illustrates that buildings are responsible for 40% of Europe's energy consumption and 30% of its CO2 emissions. In Ireland, however, the Irish Green Building Council have shown we have slightly higher emissions of 37%, of which 14% come from embodied carbon. That's 14% of Ireland's total emissions come from embodied carbon, and I believe it is the elephant in the room. Since being elected, I've engaged numerous times with the Department of Housing at various levels, and I've been continuously told their position is to wait until 2027, where the EU will instruct them on how we measure and set targets for embodied carbon. Counter to this, the Irish Green Building Council last week informed me that the 2027 target is for member states to have their embodied carbon measurement and targets in place by 2027. And so I can say that countries all over Europe are currently legislating to mitigate these emissions while we are waiting. So what is embodied carbon, apart from my hobby horse? Embodied carbon is the CO2 emitted during the lifespan of a material, from the excavation and harvesting of raw materials, product manufacture, transporting them between all processes, constructing them into our buildings, their maintenance, replacement, and finally removal and disposing of them at the end of their life. So how do we reduce embodied carbon in the construction sector? Well, I believe very simply by introducing embodied carbon measurement and targets on a phased basis akin to Part L of the building regulations, and initially through the public sector. Both Kieran O'Connor, OPW State Architect, and Pat Barry, Irish Green Building Council CEO, concurred last year in the Housing Committee debate on embodied carbon that we can begin measurement of embodied carbon now in the first quarter of 2023. Sadly, this is not happening. The report we produced in the Housing Committee addresses and provides recommendations to the Minister for Housing on practical ways of reducing embodied carbon emissions in our built environment. The construction of mid-rise timber buildings has been evolving across the planet, and we have not kept in touch with this construction revolution, considering its embodied carbon advantages. Irish construction timber has an advantageous position in terms of our timber output. Due to many who came before us, our timber industry is the fastest growing in Europe, and the roundwood harvest will be doubling over the next 15 years. Timber is a sustainable and low carbon construction material that is a compelling alternative to steel and concrete. Just under 12% of Ireland's land area is currently under forestry, and the vast majority of our construction timber is exported to the UK. The question that arises here is, why are we exporting low carbon materials that we can use domestically to reduce our embodied carbon and in turn CO2 emissions? It should also be disclosed that the Irish construction timber offers faster procurement processes, rural employment, a higher level of health and safety due to off-site fabrication, which also produces better fabrication outcomes and reduces gender inequality in this sector. It would be lost on me not to mention Part B of the technical guidance document, which deals with fire. Currently, the regulation guidance is seriously prohibitive, making it very difficult to procure timber structure buildings akin to many other jurisdictions. We must make Part B amenable to timber, where designers can use the material. Otherwise, we will be failing in our ambition to meet our climate targets. I have been very fortunate to be in a position to procure a whole life carbon zero building here in Tallaght. The Irish Green Building Council have been extremely helpful. We have used the London Energy Transformation Initiative guidelines to evolve the building design. Citywise is the client, who provide after-school tuition to school children. We have a very understanding client and a very powerful design team, which is allowing us to create a pathfinder building utilising cross-laminated timber as structure. And Arups are actually working on it, actually. So the main issue, apart from minimal knowledge in the use of CLT, has been Part B and its limitations. We had to engage Arups for the fire cert, as Dublin Fire Brigade required a design solution. The current regulations do not allow for this type of project. And we are hopeful that the building will be the first of its kind to have a fire cert in Dublin, maybe Ireland, and providing a precedent for others to work from. To achieve our whole life carbon zero building here in Tallaght, we are using, as I said, a timber CLT structure, recycled brick facade with lime mortar for end of life assembly. The windows are orientated to harness light and heat. The roof has a full array of photovoltaic panels, and the service runs are exposed and designed for minimal runs from a central core. And we hope that this building will be a demonstrator project for others to learn from, considering all of its outcomes, good or bad. So I hope I've given some insight into the challenges we are facing and the work we are doing to clear a path for decarbonisation in the construction sector. And my last word, I believe embodied carbon measurement, if it's mandatory, and when it becomes mandatory, it will go a long way in the process of helping us understand and begin to use less embodied carbon materials. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis Noel Duffy, Green Party TD for Dublin, Dublin Southwest. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to listen to our three speakers. We've got Dr. Ciara, we have John Burgess, and we've got Patrick that I forgot to mention just a little bit earlier. We're getting some questions in on Slido already, and we expect some questions from the audience here. But let's move on immediately with Dr. Ciara Ahern. And Dr. Ahern is a chartered building services engineer, and she currently is acting senior lecturer and chair of the Bachelor of Building Engineering program within the Faculty of Engineering and Built Environment here in TU Dublin. And she rotated out of the role of head of building engineering. So she's an experienced academic with over 20 years of industrial experience, participating in consultant design engineer on residential and commercial building projects. She's co-founder and lead of the Irish Building Stock Observatory, established to democratise access to robust building stock data, along with next generation building energy stock modelling techniques. So this is she's a funded investigator with SFI and Mary, actively researching energy resilience within the built environment, and co-principal investigator of the SEAI-funded climate change and related domestic retrofit overheating risk mitigation project. So she has quite a lot of experience both in the technical and in the academic field. So we're very interested in listening to your presentation.
Very good. I think I need to shorten my bio. Yeah.
I shortened it already.
So I just titled it, tongue-in-cheek, what is the Energy Performance of Building Directive ever done for us? And it's on the published data for this talk, but buildings account for 40% of energy, producing 36% of greenhouse gas emissions, or 37, 38% in Ireland. And it's quoted in the literature and European policy as having enormous potential for CO2 reduction. And that focus is, sorry, this is the wrong slide deck. So that focus is normally on existing buildings and on the existing housing stock, particularly because they're viewed as somewhat less intractable than maybe industry or transport. So the long lifespans of buildings mean there are significant risks of undesirable or suboptimal or partial refurbishments being locked into the stock, and that might render future improvements or renovations more expensive. So understanding existing building stocks before making energy efficiency interventions is vital. But this has been quite difficult historically. Lowe and Aronson in 2008 likened buildings and energy research more like a cottage industry than a serious academic endeavour. And we lacked quality data that could inform policy, and lack of policy frameworks inhibited effective policy. If we look at floor area across Europe, 3/4 of it is residential and 1/4 of it is commercial. And we say, what is the energy performance of building directive done for us? It's given us data. It's mandated a research community, research to inform policy, contribute to knowledge, and what it's done for society, maybe reflected in the state of the building stock. But EPCs are mandated, or BERs in Ireland are mandated for whenever buildings are constructed, sold or leased, or when they're grant aided. It's been fantastically successful in the residential sector because people in the residential sector access grants more regularly than they do in the commercial sector. So we have 55% of dwellings represented in the EPC database. For commercial buildings, we've less than 100,000, and we actually don't understand what percentage of the stock that is, because we don't actually know how many hotels, swimming pools, retail units there are in Ireland. There's work going on through the IBGC and ENACT. So my research focuses a lot on households because of this, accounting for 1/4. And you see in a lot of the building data reflected, they're not necessarily talking about the building sector, they've started talking about households particularly. And households use more energy than industry, and the same nearly as transport. If you look at the state of the stock, and this is stripping out erroneous data from the stock, we'll see 58% of walls are insulated, 67% of roofs are well insulated. This data is from 2014, I should point out, so it's older now. We're working on, through the Irish Building Stock Observatory, publishing a more up-to-date version. 97% of windows are double glazed, and 53% of floors are insulated. And you can see that's coming from grants. If you see the amount of grants in Ireland, roof and cavity wall insulation, which are perhaps easier measures, dwarf maybe the more kind of invasive measures such as external wall or dry lining. And you'll see high efficiency boilers or controls. Controls and systems are low cost but very high impact, and we're not seeing that prevalent in the sector. And it's actually mandated in the Energy Performance and Building Directive in 2002 that building systems get inspected, but it's still not really happening. So we're seeing the effect of grants, and we're seeing the energy efficiency of the housing sector, particularly the orange line at the bottom, improving. But research is beginning to publish that the energy efficiency improvements are slowing down, and this is not aligned with policy announcements. So we need to actually get to those more difficult measures, more low-hanging fruit in the optimization of systems, and more targeted rather than blanket policies. So there's issues as well with the quality of the data. This is the difference on the right in yellow, metered energy consumption versus the theoretical rated energy consumption. Now, this energy performance gap is out in the literature since 2012, and this is a recent article by the Sunday Times in 2023. But you can see the massive gap. Now, through the Irish Building Stock Observatory, we're processing the data, we're replacing defaults. 36% of entries into the EPC database are comprised on defaults. They're pessimistic defaults, so it's misrepresentative of the stock. So if we come back to what is the Energy Performance of Building Directive done for us in data terms, it's given us really large sample sizes at a national level. It's transparent and it's got common reporting mechanisms. It's observed and audited data. But is it robust? It is post-processing, but that requires a lot of work. But as Babbitt said, errors using inadequate data are much less than using no data at all. So the role of EPCs, it's important. First-time buyers are being assessed on their ability to repay mortgage if they're buying a G-rated home. The banks are building in costs. So the EPD is being used, or any EPCs or BORs are being used for way more than it was first intended. And so the importance of quality, robust data is imperative. And this is what the Irish Building Stock Observatory has tasked itself with doing. Democratizing access to quality data, doing all that processing on behalf of researchers so that we can turn data more quickly into information and inform policy. We're using machine learning and AI to do that, so quarterly we'll be able to publish a state of the stock, see the difference and see the effectiveness of policy and perhaps feed that back in. So here's early IBSO analysis, and this is at a Northern Ireland scale, and here it is looking just for, at instance, for Cork City. And you can see there's low gains, medium gains, high gains. And high gains are dwellings that are E1 to G plotted by small area code. So orange are areas that are districts, I suppose, or communities that are resisting the renovation wave. And why are they resisting the renovation wave? What are their characteristics? Identifying this level of data allows you to get under the bonnet and maybe make effective, nuanced policies to target those particular houses. And this is being done. So, for instance, Energy Cloud are in the business of sustainability matchmaking. So we often have excess renewable energy on the grid, excess wind, and that normally goes to waste. Energy Cloud have 10,000 houses in trial. You're taking that excess wind, you're putting it into fuel poor homes and heating their hot water. So the idea is to reach the furthest behind first and bring them forward. Autodan are also doing this on a community scale with peer-to-peer trading, switching off appliances when energy costs are high and switching on appliances when energy costs are low. And if we get social deprivation data like the public index and we overlay that on data, you have a socio-technical data set, which is a lot more informative than just a technical data set. I just want to speak briefly about the retrofit ambition. And this is research from the Irish Green Building Council and Richard Hegarty and Oliver Cannan in UCD. But we're going to retrofit 500, the plan is to retrofit 500,000 houses. And we were, doing about 12,000 a year, and that has to ramp up to 80,000 a year to meet targets. So it's quite a significant uplift. So it's 1 in 3 houses and more of that with heat pumps. And you think from the embodied carbon perspective, the amount of carbon that's going to put into our sector from materials wise. So the research by UCD has shown that by 2030, embodied carbon will actually be larger than the operational carbon. And that's for new housing. If you think the plan is to build Galway City every year for the next 7 years. It's a massive endeavour. So if you look at just a little bit under the bonnet of embodied carbon, you can see that renewables account for a huge proportion of that embodied energy. And it depends on where they were constructed in the world, really, and I suppose the quality of the grid. But I would be a huge advocate for district level heating, and Denmark, Finland, other countries have embraced district heating. You're dividing the heat pump across a district level or a community level, and it's not attributed to the house, so it reduces the embodied carbon. Windows, walls and roofs, insulation and retrofit, a lower embodied carbon associated. The other thing I'd be advocating for is low-hanging fruit is optimization first. And again, optimization is mandated under the Energy Performance Building Directive 2002, but it's not done. Research by TU Dublin in 2015, if you take domestic dwellings, shows that boilers are oversized by a factor of 1.8. Pumps are 3 times as big as actually required. And if you look at the fan laws, that means they use 8 times the power consumption. And pumps, your heating pump, believe it or not, is the 4th largest energy consuming product in the world. And radiators are oversized by a factor of 1.7. And if you throttle down the water in these systems and reduce the speed of the pump, you can save between 1 and 20% in heating systems overnight. If you did that in Europe, you'd save the same amount of energy as Ireland uses in a year. So in summary, how do we realise the ambitions of the Energy Performance Directive? Operational energy is low-hanging fruit. We could literally just optimise everyone's heating system and save the amount of energy that Ireland uses in a year. And we need to get in and do that. We need district heating to avoid carbon lock-in. We need to view buildings as components in an overall energy system, and not as separate entities. We need measured progress indicators through the Irish Building Stock Observatory, and we need to bring commercial properly into the data net. And we need targeted and nuanced policies rather than blanket policies to reach the furthest behind first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ciara from TU Dublin. So far we've had a politician, we've had an academic, and now we're going to have somebody from, I guess you could loosely call it the private sector. And our next speaker is John Burgess, and John is an associate director with Arup. So therefore he provides energy management advisory services relating to renewable energy solutions and effective systems operations. But interestingly, he's got over 30 years experience in the design and operation of the built environment in Ireland and in Australia. So he works across the full energy spectrum and is passionate about collaborating with academic, industry and non-governmental partners to promote energy-related research. So he told me earlier that, in fact, one of the things we're going to talk about today, and I hope we don't steal his thunder, is a Horizon 2020 funded project which he is helping to coordinate, which aims to develop solutions for integrated renewable energy systems right across Europe. So, John, we're very interested in hearing that, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So, forgive me, I didn't bring a slide deck. So I'm just going to introduce myself and some of my experience and put some points out for raising some questions and raising the ante in the Q&A session. I'm a practicing building services engineer. I started out my career as a bellboy designing lifts in an elevator company in Sydney. Having graduated from mechanical engineering in Trinity in Dublin, we emigrated to Australia back in '86. Not a very busy time in Ireland. And we returned to Ireland in '98, 13 years later. And what a different country it was. Celtic Tiger in full swing. You know, I remember flying in on the plane from London and all the engineers coming in to help with pharmaceutical projects around Cork Harbour. And Cork City, believe it or not, had more work happening in it then than Sydney had. You know, a city of 4 million people versus a city of 250,000. And it's been a very busy and prosperous 25 years since then. My focus in Australia, one of my roles there was as a building management system, building controls engineer for HVAC systems in buildings. And it was interesting that we would develop our own software and we would test it before it goes into the building, anywhere near the site. And we'd rock up and then we'd make sure it all worked. That was our role. It was a design and construct contracting firm. And it's where, you know, I learned the tools of the trade in building services at the same time as undertaking a master's in building services and facilities management in the University of Sydney. So with that experience, I decided to join Arup. I wasn't happy with doing one project every 3 years, which, you know, like the Sheraton Airport Hotel, if you fly into Sydney Airport, you'll see it. It took me 3 years to design and 3 years to build, as a team, obviously. I remember walking onto that site, and the first day on the site as the contracts manager for the M&E systems was Paddy's Day, and there was a bomb scare. So they all thought Misha here was responsible for closing the site. But it was an invaluable experience. And then my work with Arup in Sydney was involved on some of the Olympic projects. You know, the exhibition halls out at Homebush, where we're looking at natural ventilation solutions for very large exhibition halls. And Renzo Piano designed building, Aurora Place, a 40-story tower in the central business district, which Renzo was promoting as a sustainable building, and it was actually. We had variable air volume HVAC systems, you know, catering for a fully glass sealed box. Now, we did have winter gardens at each end of an oval-shaped floor plate to try and promote some natural ventilation. And mixed mode ventilation systems continued through and work back in Cork. So the postgraduate library extension in UCC, the extension to the Boole Library. And it's interesting how many people overseas don't realize the importance of Mr. Boole and how his role is played in everything we do now in terms of data and data management. So that extension had mixed mode ventilation systems. And I was hoping, we'd be able to use natural ventilation for most of the year. And the minute the doors are open, seats are full, and being a university library, it means full. So 1 person for every 3 square meters. And straight away, you need to run the mechanical ventilation systems. And during the recess periods in the summer, the building switches back to natural ventilation mode. And it's hugely important to remember in the push for energy efficiency that we don't throw out indoor air quality, particularly after the last 3 years. It was funny, I was presenting at the Irish Georgia Society there just before Christmas, and we were into their HQ there in near Dame Street. And as I walked in, it had been pulled forward, and the speaker was saying, and Georgian buildings are brilliant for natural ventilation. And I walked in and said, all the windows were closed, the room was full, and condensation streaming off the glass. Do you mind if I open the windows? So being a HVAC engineer, I'm a bit paranoid about ventilation. So it's, now, energy efficiency in buildings, it does annoy me a little bit. I work in an industry, and you probably agree with this, we're a self-perpetuating industry. We design buildings that are complex. They have fans, they have pumps, pipes and ducts, temperature sensors, RH sensors, CO2 sensors, and all that data is recorded on a building management system. Now, most buildings have the BMS. And what does it do for us? Turns things on and turns things off. And our BMS industry has let us down. It doesn't archive that data, nor does it provide any analytical capabilities. Now, the recast CPPD, this is the 28 version, has asked that building management systems optimize and control, provide reports and alarms to building operators. That still hasn't happened. People think they've ticked the boxes to put a BMS in, but they've missed really missed a key opportunity, and I hope that's going to change. One of my roles with Arup, I was seconded, and it was a gift job. I saw this resume come in for this job. It said, we want an energy management advisor, property portfolio across Europe, travel all European states, helping coordinate real estate managers to operate their buildings more sustainably. Ding. Can I do that, please? So I was successful in landing that commission, and I spent 3 years traveling Europe, based in Hammersmith in London. But we had 500 million euros worth of property spread across UK, France, Spain, Italy, Sweden, Germany, Netherlands, Poland. And what was really interesting what we had done, we'd got all these energy audits coming in from left, right, and center, and they're all saying the same thing. So we said, no, stop. Let's not do any more energy audits. We know what's wrong. So we built a toolkit, a sustainable operational building toolkit. There was 18 key measures. Each measure had sub-measures. And we went out and trained the real estate managers and the facilities team and said, this is what we're asking you to do. Please make sure these things happen. And then we tracked it with spreader sheets, tracker sheets. And so my role was to go and train, educate, and see how the different member states behave. And it's quite revealing. The different countries treat regulations as the key driver, and the other countries would actually go well beyond that. So I won't go so far as to name them here, but that was an eye-opener. Ireland, by the way, was actually, I felt, way up in terms of its skill base and its ability to deliver. But nonetheless, our buildings are procured in a commercial environment, and people are competing to tender for the projects. And, sometimes those tenders put money first before quality. And we end up falling down at the end. Particularly when it comes to the commissioning of the buildings, the program has run out, practical completion hasn't. That day, all the insurances are transferring, then has to hand over, and it never gets handed over properly. And then people are running for cover, hiding behind a tree, saying, well, you want me to come back? So I tried to handhold the client for soft landings, the city soft landings has been in existence for 15 years, and it's really good to see the renovation passport coming through and the logbooks that are coming through on the European renovation wave initiatives. I'm just rambling a bit, but part of what I did in that role for 3 years, I was introduced to a company who had the experience of building management systems, knew all that data was there, and said, I'm just going to connect into that LAN, so their communications network. And I'm not going to disturb the transfer of data, but I'm going to skim all the data associated with the controls out into the cloud. And they now present me, for our own office in 1 Albert Quay in Cork, all the data associated with our VRV air conditioning system and the air handling unit that's feeding our office. And we've used it with some of our clients. One of them, 50,000 points, virtual and hardwired. Trended, whatever you like. We can go in and see there's a problem with an air handling unit, show the valve has stayed open when it should be closed, or heating valve not responding, or fan not responding to the sensor. Mark the point on the graph, raise an action. Please, the BMS control company, come out and have a look, or it's the mechanical services maintenance company, fix this, or it's somebody else. We track the action until it's closed, and people can go back in straight into that point of data. This is in an ocean of data that's in the cloud. They can go straight in without having to sit in front of a computer terminal with 200 pages of BMS graphics, trying to figure out which fan call unit out of 1,000 fan call units is working efficiently or inefficiently. So that data analytics is where we need to be going forward, is having that ability to help building operators manage their buildings, which without it, it's impossible. I should just finish that. I could ramble on all day about energy efficiency in buildings, but it's a challenge. We all have to work very hard to achieve. The Fit for 55, just to mention that, it is 55% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030, based on the 1990 data. So we've got 30 years of growth, plus to be wiped off, plus 45% of that benchmark by 2030. 7 years left to achieve it. So I'm curious as to how that's going to happen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. It was John Burgess from Arup, and indeed that's an interesting question that you threw out there in the last couple of minutes, how we achieve these targets. But maybe some of the questions that we get from the audience here and online will further elucidate these things. So the last speaker that we have for this evening is Patrick Daly, and Patrick again is an academic, consultant, researcher in the field of sustainability in the built environment. He lectures part-time here in TU Dublin. And he's got a background in architectural technology and project management with over 25 years architectural experience across a range of domestic and commercial building types in both Ireland and the UK. He's also principal investigator on the Horizon 2020 funded Drive Zero project. So Patrick, I know that you've got a presentation to make, so we're interested in watching the presentation, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the physical audience and the online audience. Patrick.
Thank you very much. What I'd like to do is to give you an insight into the recently recast and updated Energy Performance Building Directive. I'm also aware there's people listening in who may not be professionals in this field, so I'm actually going to go into slow-mo and explain some concepts and theory, if that's okay, but partly for an audience who's maybe not in this building. So the Energy Performance Building Directive is a European directive to influence member states to control the energy performance of buildings and to create standards. And it came out originally in 2010, and it had an enormous impact in our sector, because for the first time, we were being required to design buildings to an energy target. Previous to that, most of the legislation across Europe was about elemental performance of particular parts of the building. So it was very common to have standards that would control the U values or the heat loss through the walls, let's say. So we had this previous approach where particular elements, maybe the efficiency of a heating system or the amount of insulation in the building, were controlled within regulations. But now a new metric came in, a new indicator, which was the total holistic energy consumption of the building. And that meant that member states had to design methods to do those calculations, and also that they were now for the first time designing to energy and carbon standards. So it was quite transformative. And as those standards developed over previous years and our efficiencies became more ambitious, like one of the last directives brought in the concept of nearly zero energy buildings. So they were very low, meant to be very low energy buildings. Those type of standards have generated within the industry a change in thinking, a change in design approach. And actually it's influenced my career, because part of what I do, I lead a master's in energy efficiency design, where we're retraining architects, engineers, technologists, people from services backgrounds, whatever, to reorientate themselves and reskill themselves in how to do this. So the EPD is a really significant piece of legislation around the world. I have some opportunity to travel. I'm just back from the United States, speaking there, and I've been to lecture in Brazil, and they're quite envious of this legislation and the impact it's had. They would see Europe as a leader in moving forward and responding to the climate crisis, and certainly in the built environment sector, we're seen as leaders. Although those within it may see ourselves not as leaders, but I think in a global context, we will be seen that way. So what I want to talk about today primarily is what there's been multiple versions of this legislation, and this latest version is bringing in some significant changes, and I want to make you aware of them, and then just discuss some problems and issues that I foresee within that transition. So just to highlight the big changes that are coming in. The first one is that they're looking for Europe to have a zero emission stock by 2050. It's a very, very ambitious challenge. You've heard the statistics of where we are at the moment and the type of carbon emissions that are coming from this sector alone, from the residential sector alone. So that's a very challenging concept. And they've also redefined, up until now, they've developed this concept of a nearly zero energy building, which means a low energy building that has a significant amount of its energy provided by renewables. They've now progressed that concept to the idea of a zero emissions building. And that will come into parlance and be legislated for by 2030. So just 7 years' time, that all new buildings and all deep renovated buildings will have to be a zero emission building. And by that, they mean all a low energy building that has all its energy met by renewables. So that is a very significant and radical step forward. And those of us that are in the design area know how challenging that is. Just to say, it's been done before. Over 16 years ago, I designed and built Ireland's first zero net energy building. So it's completely technically feasible, but it's actually quite challenging to do. And to do it economically is the real challenge. So the technical viability of that is there and has been there for a long time. But to do it economically is going to be quite a challenge. So that's the second big change within this new directive, this new version of the directive, shall we say. The other one is that they're going to set minimum energy performance standards for all buildings. And that's really radical, because up until now, the legislation was primarily for new buildings. In 2018, they said any existing building that's been renovated to a certain level will come into the net and has to achieve a certain target. In Ireland, that really was watered down, in my view, in the building regulations. But the intention was that some existing buildings would have to achieve a standard. But now they're bringing in a requirement for all buildings. But really, it's for buildings that are the poorest performing initially. That will be the focus of the directive. Poorest performing buildings will have to be upgraded. That's a mandatory requirement within the directive. So that's quite radical. And then also another key change is that when the directive came out at first, each member state could develop their own rating system. So in Ireland, we had A1, A2, A3, and B1, B2, B3. We had a particular system. It was based on primary energy. In England, they had a carbon index, carbon cost index. So the scale was completely different. And France had a different one, and Germany had a different one. Now they're going to harmonise them. They're going to harmonise them across Europe, so that as you look at any property across Europe, the scale will be the same. So that's quite a big change. I think that will have particular influence. And governments also, as before, have to develop national building renovation plans. But I think before they were strategies, whereas now when they mean plans, there's actually targeted requirements within the plan. So really the focus of this EPBD is shifting to the existing stock. The last one began to touch on it. This one is really about the existing stock, and it's quite radical, as Ciara was saying. You know, the 500,000 buildings needed to be retrofitted is a significant construction challenge. And lastly, is this quite a radical change has begun, and there's been a lot of debate about this, but actually life cycle energy analysis is now coming in for certain buildings at a certain time in the directive. In 2030, certain new buildings will need to have life cycle energy analysis done. And that changes everything. That changes everything because the research is clear. Like a good friend of mine, Pache Hernandez, when he studied here in Ireland, his master's was looking at the balance between energy used during the life cycle of the building on a day-to-day basis, your heating system, your lighting, versus the energy used to construct it in the materials, the embodied energy. So he was comparing those two, and he was already then saying, this is back in 2016, that contemporary legislation, it was possible that the type of materials we were specifying were so energy intensive that they were negating and discounting all the operational energy savings. So that was theoretically possible if you are based on conventional specification. So this shift from focusing just on operational energy to a more life cycle energy, where we're taking in the materials used in the construction, is beginning to be embedded in this particular recast. And I can virtually guarantee you, but by the next time, it will be totally embedded within it. And that's going to create this massive revolution in the sector. So just to flip through very quickly, some of the articles. Article 2 is about this concept of a zero emissions building, which I was talking about. So all the low energy consumption is to be fully covered now by renewables rather than partially. So that's quite significant. I'll go through these quickly. Article 3 is about the national renovation plans, including monitoring of those, assessment. They're being assessed by the Commission, and there's also they have to document district and communal approaches, which is much more common in continental and Scandinavian Europe. Article 4 is about the methodology for calculation. There's no significant change in that, other than they're including the possible use of metered energy. Now that creates lots of technical complications because the metered data is very different to the assessed data. So I think that's quite a complicated part of the directive. Article 5 is about setting minimum energy performance requirements. So there's no significant change there, except some previously exempted buildings, like historical buildings, are now no longer fully exempt. So the net is widening, and that's probably positive, but another challenge. I think Article 6 is one of the most significant changes. It's the definition of the zero emissions building, but also the life cycle global warming potential being calculated in accordance with the EU levels framework. That's for large buildings over 2,000 square meters. So it's not for all building types, but certainly it's the beginning of that parlance coming in to the directive. There's also requirements for member states to provide financial supports, which is absolutely essential, and it is probably one of the key issues and the elephant in the room if ever going to do this. And there's all this these minimal energy performance requirements have come in, and there's particular scales being set. But they're basically saying the poorest 15% of the buildings, they're going to classify them as G, and they want them to move up 1 to 2 bands over a particular time period. But that's going to become mandatory. There's less significant but important articles about financial support mechanisms, which I won't focus on, and providing infrastructure for transport mobility, particularly electric cars. That's being enhanced. So I'll skip some of these because I don't think they're as significant. That's about the harmonisation of the scale, and we go on. So just there's a sort of profile of our current. You can see all the low energy stock there down in the F and the Gs. So we've quite a challenge to bring all that stock up to some sort of new standards. So overall, in summary, these I think are the challenges from my perspective. We're going to see for the first time ever minimum energy performance standards across Europe. So any buildings at G rating will have to be improved. The worst 15% of the stock is going to have to be improved, and that's mandatory. And there's mandatory obligations for member states to provide financial interventions and support from that in line with social fairness. And there's also mechanisms within Europe that are there for member states to avail of. The next big significant change is this concept of life cycle assessment and global warming assessment being done. That will mean that material specification will now begin to be influenced in those larger buildings. They're going to have to rethink what type of materials are going into those buildings. And if that concept expands in later revisions to the EPBD, it will really revolutionise the way we're designing buildings. There are certainly a number of technical challenges, not just to achieving deep energy retrofit, but I think one of them is the mechanisms that we're assessing, the calculation methods that we're assessing energy performance under. There's a massive performance gap between that and reality. And so I think to make this work more in line with the aspirations of the savings, we need to actually adapt these methodologies to close that performance gap. And I think another aspect that's not within the EPBD, but is very much now embedded within European policy and as an area of research that I'm involved in, is this concept of circularity. That there's a possibility that if we construct these and improve these buildings in the wrong way, we will end up with higher levels of waste and materials that cannot be reutilized within the supply chain, and we'll be creating a significant waste problem in the future if we don't design in a circular way. And also this concept of circularity is very strongly related to embodied energy and embodied carbon aspects, because if we have materials and components and elements that can re-enter the supply chain within the building sector, then their embodied energy is actually getting a double cycle. So it's a significant embodied energy saving if we can bring those materials back into a second or third life cycle. So it's an emerging area, but it's a policy area within Europe. I'm surprised it isn't specifically and explicitly stated within the EPBD document. And I looked at the policy references that the EPBD is based on, and it's not explicitly stated, but it should be. But I think that is also a technical challenge as we move forward. So a really significant legislative change is going to have a significant impact, as have the precursors. And it'll create a design challenge for the profession, how to respond to this. But I think the societal impacts will be really positive. Many people feel it hasn't gone far enough. The proposed EPD revision during negotiation was cut back. There were proposals that everything would have assessments for global warming potential. So, but that's the democratic nature of the European Union. There's negotiations and things have to be mutually agreed between member states. But I really welcome this EPBD. I can see challenges for the industry, but overall, I think the societal impacts are very positive. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Patrick, and thanks very much for the overview of the proposed directive. For those of you in the know, the directive hasn't yet been adopted, obviously, So we mentioned earlier that Ciara, the Irish Green MEP, is the rapporteur for this proposal in the European Parliament, and in fact it goes to the plenary session of the European Parliament for a vote next week. So it's quite close to being adopted, but the Parliament and the Council have got to adopt it together. Those member states and the democratically elected European Parliament have got to come to an agreement on it, and only then does it become a piece of legislation with all of the intending effects and things like that. So listen, I think that we'll have to throw the floor open for questions now at this stage. I've got some questions coming in on Slido already. Some people are asking whether or not they can see the presentations that have been made here during the session, and the answer is yes. Anybody who's registered either online or to be here in presence will get a copy of the presentation. So thank you to all of the presenters who went to the trouble of making presentations. So do we have any questions here from the room? If not, I'll go directly to Slido. So we've got a question over here in the corner. Yes, please. Could you just explain maybe if you have an interest in the particular area before you ask your question?
Sure, yeah, Paul O'Connor's my name. I'm involved with Smart Building Solutions and Master Systems Integrator. And yes, we've a massive challenge ahead of us, and it's a big challenge in relation to the retrofit of commercial buildings. And one of the bigger challenges there is the split incentive and how we get up and overcome that. So I'd like to get your opinions on how we might do that. And that's open.
Okay, so maybe if we could start with you, John, on that, seeing that you come from the trade side.
France already advanced that point. You know, they make it a legal requirement for the landlord to collect all the tenant data. You know, no issue with GDPR, it's energy data after all. And they report on the efficiency of the whole building. So we need to do the same as it was. It should not be let that the landlord comes in and it's only caring for the lighting in the atrium or the lift lobbies and the lifts. Or, you know, they need to really help the tenants in their building run their systems efficiently. So that's sharing of data between landlords and tenants has to happen. It doesn't work at the moment.
Okay, can I just move to a question that we got here on Slido, which I think is sort of quite pertinent. It's from Oren Reid, and his comment is the lack of qualified personnel who are available to work on retrofitting buildings. He says the labour market issue has significant impacts in meeting our targets. Can I turn to our elected representative here and look for your comments on that?
In the context of training people, it's a very difficult problem. I think in the context of not only retrofitting, but in the context of building houses in the country. Like we've a number of different areas where we're trying to train people. I know the government, from what I understand, are pushing to train up people across the country in retrofitting. It might not be fast enough, but it's difficult to get people to come into that system, as far as I know. Jennifer might actually, in the context of TU Dublin, in where the incoming students in that space. As far as I know, when I was working in Bolton Street, which was where the apprentices were based, I know there's a lot of difficulty during the recession of where people went and the whole system that we have in the country. And I'm not sure if that's how well that's being run yet. But I know, from what I understand within the government, they are pushing to train up as many people as possible.
Okay, so I think the thing is that we've got a very tight labour market in Ireland, and it's a challenge for everybody. But Jennifer, the challenge that's thrown out to you by Francis Noel, do you have any answer to this skills shortage?
Well, I think the whole concept and the whole area of apprenticeship is under deep consideration in terms of how it can respond to a different set of challenges in many ways than it has done before. So this need for reconsidering the whole of apprenticeship to, I think, address things from pre-manufacturing all the way through to implementation on site. I think the opportunities have extended, the needs are accelerating, and it's actually figuring out now, do we have actually the people coming through the system who would be attracted into the area? So what are the benefits for being able to be part of the transformation, I think is at the heart of how we fix it. But it's not an easy fix. And I think we have a lot of areas that are changing rapidly in terms of the needs of the industry, and to be able to be more agile with our response through apprenticeship and skills-based learning is where we have to go.
Okay, but for sure there are some challenges ahead to meet the targets.
Yeah.
As John mentioned at the end of his presentation, this is one of the issues. I have somebody back here in the audience who wants to ask. Ciara, do you want to continue?
Decarbonisation of heat is relying on heat pump technology. So we are looking at a major increase in the need for refrigeration trades. So that is, one key focus area. We're going to reduce all our oil and gas-fired boilers and going to replace with heat pumps. So when those heat pumps fail on Christmas Eve, who do you ring? It's the maintenance of these heat pumps, which they are low maintenance, but they do need somebody to come and check. It requires a massive increase in the refrigeration trade in Ireland. So that certainly is one focus area that we need to make sure there's more people coming into the refrigeration apprenticeship schemes.
So you're saying it's not just the retrofitting itself that needs skilled people,
Yeah,
it's the maintenance of everything.
The heat pump technology itself is, of course, there's the appropriate re-insulation of old buildings done the right way. It's hugely important and complex. And I'm just making the point with electrification of heat. And the other point to make with that, and I've had feedback from people recently where they turned off their heat pumps and turned the oil boiler back on. Why? Because the price of electricity is still indexed to oil. So we need to decouple the price of electricity and make a fair game. So it's bloody crazy. I can't be running oil. I'll turn on the heat pump instead of the other way around.
Okay, and I'm also right in saying that when you have a heat pump that it runs at a slightly lower temperature than people might be expecting. I don't know if anybody here wants to specifically address Ciara. Dr. do you want to answer that question?
Heat pumps need to be run at low temperatures, and then they need to be on for longer because they have less of the temperature difference to heat the room. And also they work better at a different delta T in their flow and return. So there's nuances to heat pumps, and I'd make a comment there on the plumbing profession, but there's no central body for plumbing professionals in Ireland, and there's no methodology for rolling out CPD programs. I was involved in an EU Optimus project, and it was for English-speaking countries in Europe and Malta and the UK, and they all just could go back and roll out further training for plumbers. We're not able to do that in Ireland. We don't have a centralised body, and there's no such thing as a simple heating system anymore. There's no such thing as a simple system. And like in Ireland, space heating is 70% of our consumption. And so it's the main system. And I'd really like to see some sort of professional body coming in that, you can further upskill.
Okay, thanks. We haven't come to you yet, Patrick, on this round. Is there anything that you want to add?
Yeah, just on heat pumps, they're much more complicated than conventional boilers. They have compressors, a number of valves, a number of pumps. So from my experience, the maintenance intervention is higher. I've worked with a number of local authorities that have begun to implement heat pumps in retrofit as policy, but they're a number of years on, they're now realising they have a significant maintenance cost. So again, it's about taking a lifetime consideration and not just a snapshot perspective.
Okay, there's an interesting comment has just come in on Slido from Georgina Malloy, and she says that apprenticeships are now listed on the CEO form, which will hopefully help with the workforce issues. And she says that we also need to support more women into the industry, particularly because today is the day after International Women's Day. So thank you for that comment, Georgina. But sorry, there was somebody back here in the audience who wanted to ask a question. Make a comment.
My name is Chen Ruby. I'm working as senior project consultant at IES. And my question, I have two questions. The first one is the operational and the software and the related regulations. So as far as I know, the SEI will publish the official operational energy software soon, which can give you the 3D version of the building and give you the operational energy as well. So what do you think the impact on the current Part L and the, as Patrick said, there will be a huge gap between the real energy performance and the Part L at the moment. So what do you think is the impact? And because as far as I know, as per the CFC TM54, there could be a huge potential for this field. That's the first one. And the second one is for the natural ventilation and the mixed mode. So at the moment, we all know, like for the Part F compliance and the CFC TM52, which is for the Part L compliance, is required for the naturally ventilated building or mixed mode building. So is there any more requirements in the building regulations for this field? And what do you think for this natural ventilation and mixed mode system? Yeah, thank you.
John, can I address that question to you? Because to me, that's a rather technical question and you've got the sort of experience. So not an academic question, it's not a technical question. Is it possible to give a short answer? Because I want to try and get as many questions as possible.
But to go back to the first one, mind the gap, so it's always been the case, that we try to predict and estimate how much energy is going to go in, and actually that's the case for our building energy ratings, or the EPCs in Europe and the UK. So we say, that building is a class B or an A class, and then we go and hand over the keys, and then the DEC says it's a D class. So actually you're measuring two different things. So one is looking at the building associated energy and not the actual process energy that's going on inside it. But the display energy certificates are looking at all the energy, so all the plug loads for your computers and what people are using. And that's obviously impacted by the occupancy density. So you could actually sparsely populate your building and have a very energy efficient building, but is it really achieving what's required? And maybe that means we should look at different KPIs. Say what's the actual energy footprint of that building per person as opposed to per square meter. And that's another debate. The second question. Look, it is frustrating. The whole building energy rating system never really was clear between the difference between fully air conditioned and naturally ventilated buildings. And we need to have mixed mode ventilation. Like it or not, our systems, our climate is such that we will have rooms that have to have the windows fully closed when there's a howling gale, a blizzard blowing, and you want to still provide a service. And in those situations, particularly after COVID-19, it's no longer acceptable to have poor indoor air quality. I think for too long, building services profession has got away with poor indoor air quality because people don't realise what's happening. But those days are gone. And after COVID-19, people are very aware of what CO2 levels are required to maintain reasonable healthy environments. So I'd say I can't answer your question on what's happening with EPBD and what's happening with Part L in addressing the mixed mode ventilation scenario, but I hope there will be protocols in place to allow us to measure and include for mixed mode ventilation systems.
Okay, John, thanks for that. We're actually quite close to our time, so we take one final question from the audience. Yes.
Just follow on, John Dawson is my name, TU Dublin researcher. Right at the start, the first slide was it's 40% of greenhouse gases come from buildings. Just to follow your point, and straight away I said, does that mean just the fabric, or does it mean what the building is generating every year? And what's the answer to that? Because
historically, that 40% is relating to operational data.
Operational?
Yeah, that's historic. That will change because we are now looking at the embodied carbon. As our buildings are going to be run more efficiently, the life cycle carbon balance of a building will typically be 50% operational, 50% embodied, or even more on the embodied side. So that's hence the push. And I'd love to see this building that you're involved in. Yeah, this timber frame housing in Ireland, and you are right. Most of our timber frame materials are being exported to the UK. Why can't we do it in Ireland?
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to just end up with one last question, which is a sort of a political question, so I'll turn to the politicians in the room. It's actually about the cost of retrofitting. And the contributor says that the cost of retrofitting is prohibitive. So the question is, it's time related. So a 25-year-old obviously would benefit more from a house that's been retrofit. fitted than somebody who is 65 years of age when the house has been retrofitted. So the thing is, the question is, how can the government intervene on this, and should the debt for the cost of retrofitting sit with the individual or with the property itself? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I did ask Taoiseach, could you take an equity of your property to invest it and sell it forward? And we didn't. This was the former Taoiseach, you know, and he didn't really say much to it. And maybe that's not his space. But I have asked that. I think that's a qualified way to go forward. I did some calculations when we're in negotiations to run up to the government. And I think it's about 100 billion euros is what's required to retrofit all the housing stock in the States. Probably more now, but it was 3 years ago. It's probably 200 billion now. But that was kind of the figure, and you know, the state can only, you know, put out so much, you know, money, and I think we're putting out a fair amount at the moment in the context of grants. I think if you're low certain income or you're in social housing, it's all free. And then there are various grants. You know, I think you can get grants up to. Client I have 30 grand, yeah, he's only on 30k, and I think, you know, there's other grants then in the context of what I suppose brought out recently with vacant units. Recona, I think it is, let's get them mixed up, but it's where if you have Ciara property, you get 50 grand from the state just to repurpose that building, and then you can get your SEAI grants on top of that. So you're going to 75 grand to repurpose, but in the context if you're living in your house, you know, there are some people stuck in the middle who, you know, I know I've received quite a few emails giving out saying it's not fair, it's for the rich or it's for the poor. For me, it's in the middle. But this, you know, the state has a certain amount of money, carbon taxes going back towards those retrofitting grants, and you know, it's going to take a while to turn that around. But I think the Green Deal, there's money coming in from there as well. I don't know if all the stats on that, but there is money coming from that end as well. Probably not enough, but you know, I always like to compare the state's coffers with your own at the end of the month, where you spend your money. A lot of it goes into one particular area, and then it's a bit of disposable. And I think the state is like that as well. There's lots of places the money could go. So I kind of think it's fair where it is at, and I'm sure whoever it is, it might seem unfair to certain people, and it is. But I don't know how you square that.
Okay. I mean, as with all these discussions, you know, you can continue with questions and answers for at least another hour. But you know, we promised that we'd finish at a quarter to 7, but it's come beyond that now. So I want to say thank you to everybody on the panel. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for contributing your expertise and your experience. I want to thank you, the audience here. I especially want to thank Jennifer for giving us the loan of the hall for this event tonight. And I want to thank those people who are watching on YouTube. And we know that for these events, many people watch the YouTube recording afterwards. And that will be available on the European Commission or Commission Representation YouTube channel. You can find the link. We'll send you the link afterwards for those of you who have been here. So listen, all that remains to me is to thank our contractors for this event, we the people who have been extremely helpful to us in setting this thing up. So thank you to everybody. I wish you all a good evening. I hope it stopped raining by the time you get out. Thank you and safe home. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I mean, actually,